They waited 3 days before opening the door. The guards had been instructed not to disturb him. But by the third night, something had begun to seep from beneath the door, something thick and foul. The corridor stank of rot, like spoiled meat left in the summer sun. When they finally pushed open the heavy doors to the royal chamber, they found what no servant, no man, was prepared to see. The once mighty King of England lay sprawled in his silk-drenched bed. His stomach had burst in the night. The sheer pressure of putrefying gases tore open the bloated corpse, spilling black, sticky fluid into the feather mattress. His flesh was purple and green, splitting, bubbling. The air was heavy with the stench of death. No one spoke. One man gagged. Another fled. This was how it ended, for the most feared king in English history. Alone. Decomposing. Exploded in his bed. But this was only the final scene in a far darker descent. The rot had begun long before death. And the crown he wore? It was already poisoned. Before the rot, there was glory. Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of June 1491, in Greenwich Palace, beneath painted ceilings and silk-draped cradles. He was not meant to rule. That destiny belonged to his older brother, Arthur, the heir to the Tudor legacy. But fate, as it often does in royal houses, had other plans. Arthur died in 1502 just a teenager. Some said it was sweating sickness. Others whispered it was divine intervention. Whatever the cause, the crown passed not to the prince prepared for it, but to the younger, brighter, hungrier boy, Henry. When his father, Henry VII, died in April of 1509, the 17-year-old prince became king. And England rejoiced. The boy who took the throne was no monster, no tyrant, no butcher. He was magnificent. 6'2", broad-shouldered, muscular, an unusual height for the time. He rode horses with skill and fury, danced with court ladies until dawn, composed songs on the lute, and debated with bishops and scholars alike. He was fluent in Latin and French, well-versed in scripture, and fascinated by theology. His mind was sharp, but his body was sharper. Every inch of him seemed born for grandeur. Foreign ambassadors marveled at him. Nobles adored him. The people loved him. "His Majesty is the handsomest potentate I have ever set eyes on," wrote one Venetian observer in awe. "Above all others, he is royal." That same year he married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow. A princess of Spain, regal, intelligent, and deeply pious, Catherine brought with her the prestige of Europe's most powerful Catholic dynasty. Their union was framed as one of destiny, a renewal of England's greatness. Their court was a thing of dreams. Balls, tournaments, masks. Lanterns hung from gilded arches, and musicians filled the air with sonatas and lute song. Henry wore rich velvets, fine embroidery, and cloth of gold. He hosted intellectuals and artists from the continent, seeking to craft a Renaissance England to rival Florence and Rome. He was not yet Bloody Henry. He was a golden lion in the prime of youth, a second Arthur, some said, a king of myth. But beneath the silk and spectacle, shadows stirred. Catherine bore him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. One child after another died in infancy or was lost before birth. With each miscarriage, the whispers grew louder. The Tudor dynasty had been built on blood. Was this the divine reckoning? Henry began to worry. And when Henry worried, he did not shrink, he obsessed. He grew increasingly anxious about securing a male heir. The Tudor line was still new, still fragile. If he died without a son, all of England could fall into another war of succession. Henry feared chaos. He feared weakness. And above all, he feared irrelevance. It was in this emotional vacuum that Anne Boleyn entered his world. She was young, witty, sophisticated. Unlike Catherine, and refused to be merely a mistress, she demanded more. And Henry, accustomed to taking what he wanted, was captivated. But the Catholic Church would not allow him to marry his brother's widow. So began the slow, smoldering rupture between Henry and Rome. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return, just briefly, to the boy king at his peak. The one who rode through London to cries of joy. The one who stood in sunlight, glowing, radiant with promise. He was a man of boundless charm, of intellectual curiosity, of charisma that moved crowds. And yet, power when unguarded begins to rot. And Henry's power had no guardrails. No one dared say no to him. Not his ministers. Not his bishops. Not even his queen. He was not simply king, he was becoming divine in his own eyes. And divinity, as every fallen angel knows, comes with its own damnation. The tragedy of Henry VIII is not simply that he became a tyrant. It is that he began as something better. And even the brightest stars, when they collapse, become black holes. This was the man who would one day have his friends executed, his wives beheaded, his churches burned, and his body, his once magnificent body, left to rot until it tore itself apart from within. But first he danced. Power doesn't shatter in a single moment. It fractures, quietly, invisibly, until the crack becomes a chasm. For Henry, that fracture began in January of 1536, in the heart of winter, beneath the iron sky of Greenwich. It was supposed to be a celebration. A tournament. The king loved to joust, he'd always loved it. It was more than sport, it was theater, masculinity, divine warfare in armor. At age 44 he was older than many of his opponents, but he insisted on competing. He refused to appear weak. The lance struck his body with thunderous force. He was thrown violently from his horse, crashing to the ground with a sound described by witnesses as, like the fall of a great tree. The impact knocked him unconscious for over 2 hours. There were whispers, "The king is dead." He awoke. But something inside him never did. The fall reopened an old leg wound, one he had suffered years earlier in a similar accident. But this time, it didn't heal. The infection set in quickly. The leg began to swell. Then it split. Ulcers formed, deep, suppurating, open sores that refused to close. Doctors applied poultices, drained the wound, and wrapped it in linen soaked with wine and vinegar. Nothing worked. The injury would fester for the rest of his life. The pain changed him. Once graceful, he now moved with a limp. His agility vanished. He rode less. Danced not at all. The strong, handsome Lion of England became a man anchored to his own body, a prisoner of pus and flesh. The wound smelled. Courtiers noted the stench. One physician remarked that the king's leg was a living tomb. But it wasn't just the leg. He began to eat, obsessively. Turkey legs, roasted meats, spiced puddings, sugared fruits. Servants recorded daily feasts of over 5,000 calories. Wine flowed. So did gravy. He ballooned to over 300 pounds with a waistline that reached nearly 54 inches. He could no longer walk without assistance. A custom-designed mechanical lift was installed to carry him up and down staircases. His armor had to be expanded, then abandoned entirely. His body betrayed him. And from that betrayal, his mind followed. He grew paranoid, moody, suspicious of everyone, including his closest advisors. He lashed out, sometimes at random. He ordered executions on whispers. He vacillated between bursts of generosity and violent rages. One courtier described him as a god with the moods of a devil. And yet, in the eyes of the world, he remained England's supreme ruler, God's anointed monarch. How could this be? Because Henry had done something no other English king had dared. He had made himself head of the church. In 1534, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, breaking from the Pope and forever altering the soul of the nation. Why? Because the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He believed God had cursed him for marrying his brother's widow, and for failing to produce a male heir. And Bullen promised him a son. Catherine had given him only Mary. The solution, Henry believed, was to sever the rope that tied him to Rome. The act of supremacy passed. Priests were forced to swear loyalty to Henry as spiritual leader. Those who refused were executed. Among them, Sir Thomas More, one of Henry's closest friends. More's death was not just political, it was personal. Henry loved him, admired him, but still he sent him to the block. When the executioner raised More's severed head, it was said the king wept, and then ordered another round of wine. Anne Boleyn, for all her cleverness and charm, gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1533. Henry was disappointed, deeply. In 1536, just months after his leg injury, Anne miscarried a male child. Something in Henry snapped. In the eyes of many, his accident, his spiritual defiance, and Anne's miscarriage all occurred within one cursed month, and was arrested. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were absurd. The evidence fabricated. But Henry had made up his mind. Anne was executed at the Tower of London on May 19, 1536, just 5 months after his fall from the horse. 2 queens down. No son to show for it. The rot had spread. And still, this was not the end. The leg continued to ooze. The throne grew colder. And the man who once dazzled Europe began to speak only in threats and blood. If you think you've seen the worst, stay with me. What happens next will haunt you. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. You'll need a guide for what's coming. By now the king no longer laughed. The halls of Hampton Court were quieter. The music that once danced through the rafters had dulled to a whisper. Courtiers no longer met his eyes. They bowed lower, spoke less, and prayed never to be summoned alone. Because the man who now sat on the throne of England was a stranger to mercy. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by sword. Her crime? Adultery, incest, and high treason. But everyone knew the truth. Her only sin was failing to give Henry a son. She was beheaded at the Tower of London at age 35, her neck severed in a single clean stroke. Eyewitnesses said she looked serene, forgiving even. Henry wore white the day she died. And just 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour, a plain, soft-spoken lady-in-waiting who had charmed him with humility and obedience. Unlike Anne, Jane knew when to be silent. In October 1537, she gave him what no wife before her had, a living son, Edward. At last Henry had his heir. A prince. A Tudor. The chain would continue. But the joy lasted only 12 days. Jane died of postnatal fever. Her body failed her as all the others had. Henry wept, but not for long. He called her his true wife, and had her buried beside him. Even in death, she was the only queen who remained by his side. With Jane dead and his son a fragile infant, Henry turned back to politics. And no man had done more for his reign than Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell had been his fixer, his architect, the one who orchestrated the break from Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and filled the royal treasury with Catholic gold. He had also arranged the king's next marriage, to Anne of Cleves, a noblewoman from Germany. But when Henry laid eyes on Anne for the first time, he was disgusted. "She looks like a horse," he muttered. The marriage was a disaster. It was never consummated. Henry blamed Cromwell for the embarrassment and humiliation. In July 1540, Cromwell was arrested. Despite decades of loyal service, he was charged with treason and heresy, and executed without a trial. The man who had built the king's empire was now food for crows on Tower Hill. Henry later regretted it. But the damage was done. One by one, the men who helped him rise were now rotting underground. The king was alone, and growing more paranoid by the hour. Later that same month, Henry married again, this time to Catherine Howard, a teenager, possibly just 17 years old. Henry was nearly 50. Obese, boil-covered, dragging one leg behind him. She was beautiful, vibrant, a rose in a garden of ash. And she was unfaithful. Catherine had been secretly meeting with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper. When the affair was uncovered, Henry was devastated. Eyewitnesses said he sobbed, muttered, screamed her name for days. But he ordered her death anyway. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was led to the block. Before kneeling, she whispered that she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. She was barely out of childhood. And Henry? He aged overnight. By the mid-1540s, Henry's body had become a map of disease. His ulcerated leg now required daily draining. His belly was massive, stretched by endless banquets. He had gout, constant migraines, and may have suffered from type 2 diabetes. He experienced wild mood swings, violent outbursts, and was heard muttering to ghosts at night. He surrounded himself with relics, charms, and holy trinkets, as though some unseen curse had descended on the crown. He saw betrayal everywhere. Ministers were rotated in and out like pawns. Friends disappeared. Wives were disposable. Yet, there was one final queen. In 1543, Henry married Catherine Parr, an educated, widowed noblewoman who was more nurse than lover. She read to him, managed his medicine, soothed his rages, and perhaps most importantly, she survived him. Catherine Parr was the only one of Henry's 6 wives who would outlive him. By now he could barely walk. He spent most days in bed, attended by a wheelchair-like device, surrounded by stench and silence. The boy who once danced through palaces now sat surrounded by rot, echoes, and ghosts. His throne still gleamed, but his crown felt heavier than ever. What remained was not a king but a shell of appetite, rage, and regret. And even that would not last much longer. Henry's body breaking down. His environment, machines, smell, fluids. Isolation, delusion, loss of human dignity. Tension building toward death. Court silence, denial, and quiet terror. There are few things more terrifying than a man who ruled the world, rotting alive. By 1545, Henry VIII was barely recognizable. Gone was the gallant knight who once dazzled Europe. In his place sat a swollen, weeping body held together by bandages, machinery, and the fear of his court. His leg wound, untreated properly for nearly a decade, had grown into a gaping ulcer nearly the size of a man's fist. Each day, servants were forced to unbind the limb and drain it with cloths, syringes, and hot poultices. The smell was unbearable. Physicians masked their faces. Some nearly vomited. One foreign ambassador described the king's presence as a living corpse soaked in wine and oil. But the wound was only part of the decay. His belly, swollen by years of binge eating and inactivity, had become massive. It hung over his groin in folds. Beneath it, sweat pooled. His skin chafed and blistered. He could no longer bathe without help, and often refused to do so. His stools were frequent and loose, requiring multiple attendants to clean and redress him each day. A mechanical hoist had been built to lift him from his bed and lower him into chairs. He could not walk. He could not stand. He had to be rolled between rooms like a piece of broken furniture. Even his bed was altered, reinforced to hold his weight, and layered with cloth to absorb the fluids that leaked from his legs and body at night. He did not sleep so much as gasp through the hours, muttering, sweating, coughing. Those who served him never stayed long. The inner rooms of the palace, once warm with music, had become a tomb of velvet and silence. He spoke to no one for days at a time. Then suddenly he would burst out in paranoia and rage, accusing servants of poisoning his food or plotting to kill his son. Some nights he could be heard calling out names in the dark: Catherine and Thomas, Cromwell, Jane. Other nights he shouted at unseen enemies, screamed for God. Physicians feared approaching him. Ministers sent written messages rather than enter his chambers. He trusted no one. He loved no one. He had become the most powerful man in the realm, and the most alone. His son Edward VI was now 8 years old, pale, brilliant, and sickly. Henry's entire legacy rested on the child's survival. But even this triumph, this long-desired heir, was haunted. Edward was kept away from his father. Shielded from the disease, the rot, the cries. He rarely saw the boy, but he often stared at portraits of him, and wept. Some said he knew Edward would not live long. Others believed the king had begun to fear what came after death, that God might judge him for what he had done. He ordered masses for the souls of the wives he executed, yet never spoke their names aloud. He hoarded relics, crucifixes, rosaries, tiny icons of the Virgin. A man who once tore down the Catholic Church now clung to its bones. In the halls beyond his chamber, the court had begun to plan for a future without him. No one dared speak it aloud. But they knew. The stink. The silence. The fact that no one had seen the king in weeks. They spoke in coded language. His Majesty is not to be disturbed. The king requires additional rest. A draft has upset his grace. But everyone knew the truth. Henry was dying. And no one wanted to be in the room when it happened. In the final weeks of January 1547, Henry ceased to move. He lay in his great bed, his 53-year-old body now reduced to a throbbing, motionless mass. His skin had gone purple. His breath shallow. He refused last rites. Refused to confess. He had ordered so many deaths by his own word. Perhaps now, he feared what confession might require. And then, on the night of January 27th, his servants noticed something strange. A dark fluid was leaking from the mattress. His leg had ruptured again. The pressure inside his belly, years of swelling, fluid, decay, had begun to build. Still, no one dared call it. Not until the next morning when the room grew quiet. When the stench reached the corridor. When even the rats, it was said, had vanished from the corners. Only then did someone enter. And what they found was not a king, but a bloated corpse, split open by the gases of its own decay. They buried him in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, next to Jane Seymour. But even in death there was no dignity. On the journey to his tomb, the coffin began to leak. A black pool formed on the church floor. Dogs entered and lapped at it. Eyewitnesses whispered, it was the judgment of God. For 3 days, the doors to Henry VIII's private chamber at Whitehall Palace remained shut. It was January 25, 1547. The final frost of winter clung to the leaded windows, and a strange quiet blanketed the royal household. No messages left the room. No one was summoned inside. And yet, within those walls, the most feared man in England was dying. The king had refused to see a priest. He had forbidden last rites. His physicians, still terrified of provoking him, did not press. Instead, they stood in silent corners, whispering behind their sleeves, praying he would change his mind. But Henry believed he would recover. He always had. His body had betrayed him, yes, swelling, leaking, erupting, but his mind still clung to the idea that he was chosen. That kings did not die like common men. He issued no final will. He called for no confessions. He even instructed his attendants to prepare his riding clothes, as if he might leave his bed and mount his horse at dawn. But his body had other plans. By the early hours of January 26th, the signs were unmistakable. His stomach, already bloated, had begun to swell unnaturally. It distended so violently that even touching the skin made him howl. Beneath the taut, purple flesh, gases churned. Fluids shifted. Servants whispered that it sounded like a storm in his belly. His leg had reopened again. Pus oozed across the sheets. A court physician attempted to clean it, only to vomit into a bucket and be escorted out, pale and shaking. Henry coughed dark blood onto the pillows. At one point he tried to rise from bed and fell face first onto the floor, unable to lift himself. The servants dared not help him without permission. He lay there for nearly an hour, groaning, before they dared to lift him back into bed. Custom dictated that kings be given final rites, a sacred ritual of confession, communion, and anointing. It was the final act of spiritual preparation before death. But Henry had outlawed papal authority. He had rewritten the spiritual map of England. Now he hesitated. Summoning a priest might be seen as weakness. For 2 days his advisors waited for him to ask. He never did. Instead he muttered to the walls. His lips moved in silent prayer, or was it argument? Servants heard him arguing with himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping. Not yet. I'm not ready, they are liars. By the third night, January 27th, whispers spread through Whitehall. One servant claimed to hear screaming from the chamber. Another swore she heard him sobbing his daughter's names. Someone reported thudding sounds, like fists pounding against wood. But no one entered. The king had left strict instructions. He was not to be disturbed. The royal physicians waited just beyond the doors. Ministers huddled in nearby rooms. And the guards? Well, the guards began to step farther and farther away. The smell, they said, had begun to leak beneath the door. Sometime in the early hours of January 28, 1547, the palace fell into an unnatural stillness. No coughing. No gasping. No groaning. Only silence. A flickering lamp was lit in the hallway. The Queen, Catherine Parr, had not been summoned. The Prince, Edward, remained asleep. But inside the king's chamber, death had come. When his chief attendants finally entered, they found him lying on his back, mouth agape, eyes glazed, the bed soaked through. A black fluid had pooled beneath his body. His stomach had ruptured during the night. The gases had built to such intensity that his abdomen had split open, tearing through layers of cloth, skin, and padding. Blood, bile, pus, and internal matter seeped into the mattress. It was not a death. It was an eruption. A royal detonation. The smell was unbearable. One attendant fainted on the spot. Another gagged violently and ran for the stairs. A third collapsed to his knees and wept. The chamber was cleared. The windows thrown open. But the stench could not be contained. A clerk attempted to record the death formally, but no cause of death was written. Just the date and the phrase, His Majesty passed peacefully into God's hands. But no one who had seen it believed that. Behind closed doors they whispered it differently. He exploded. It was January 28, 1547. The king was dead. But no bells tolled. No heralds cried the news from rooftops. No black banners were unfurled across the realm. For nearly 3 full days England did not know. The man who had ruled with unmatched brutality, divine conviction, and golden might, the very embodiment of kingly power, had died alone in a pool of his own fluids, and his ministers were terrified to admit it. Because the future was a question no one could answer. Inside Whitehall Palace the corridors were cold. Windows had been thrown open to dispel the stench, but the smell lingered. So did the fear. The king's chamber was sealed. The body, bloated, ruptured, decomposing, was wrapped in sheets and herbs, but no one dared look directly at it for long. Outside that chamber an empire waited. The Privy Council, Henry's most trusted political advisers, gathered in whispers behind oak doors. No one spoke Henry's name above a murmur. No one touched his chair at the council table. The throne was still warm, but empty. Henry VIII's successor was a boy, Edward VI, his 9-year-old son. Pale, serious, thin as a reed, Edward had been raised under tutors and physicians, kept away from the horrors of court life. He was devout, clever, and frighteningly earnest, but he was also a child. And the burden of the crown was far too heavy for such small shoulders. When he was told his father was dead, Edward did not cry. Instead he asked what would become of the church. What prayers should be said. whether he was permitted to change policy. He had been trained, not loved. Edward's coronation took place on February 20, 1547, less than a month after his father's death. But the pageantry couldn't hide the anxiety. The realm was uneasy. Henry had ruled for 38 years. Under him, the very soul of England had been rewritten. Monasteries razed, saints cast aside, the Pope banished. Now that the architect was gone, the nation trembled. Was it truly over? Or had the reckoning only begun? Edward, though a child, was a fierce Protestant. Under the guidance of reformers like Edward Seymour, his uncle, now Lord Protector, and Archbishop Cranmer, the English Church began to pivot further from Catholic tradition. Latin masses were replaced by English prayers. Stained glass was smashed. Holy relics were confiscated. Statues of the Virgin were burned in public squares. Where Henry had merely torn the church away from Rome, Edward's regime sought to purify it, to burn out its last remaining traces. But the more reforms they introduced, the more division they sowed. In the countryside, peasants rioted, demanding the return of old customs. In London, Catholic plots brewed in silence. Nobles who had once danced for Henry now picked sides in a religious war that threatened to erupt at any moment. The king was gone, and his throne had become a theological battlefield. Meanwhile, Henry's body still lay unburied. Wrapped in lead-lined cloth, soaked in herbs and sealed in a wooden coffin, he was transported slowly, carefully from Whitehall to Windsor Castle, where he would be buried beside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the only woman who had given him a male heir. But the journey was a spectacle of quiet horror. Despite the cold winter air, the corpse leaked. The gases trapped within his abdomen caused pressure to build. At one stop along the route, dark liquid seeped through the wood. Eyewitnesses claimed dogs began licking the stain beneath the cart. The scene was so disturbing that it echoed through the gossip of Europe. One ambassador wrote, "Surely it is a sign. God has made his displeasure known. The king who thought himself above the Pope is returned to the earth with filth and rot." Even before his coffin reached Windsor, the legends had begun. In inns and churches, from barons to blacksmiths, one phrase passed from mouth to mouth. God has judged him. Some believed his bloated corpse was a warning. Others saw his suffering as penance for his sins. 6 wives. 2 beheaded. 1,000 executed. The break from Rome. The destruction of the monasteries. The death of Thomas More. They called him Henry the Butcher. Henry the Cursed. The king of rotten flesh. He had ruled with an iron fist. But now, he was remembered not for his glory, but for his decay. Once there was a boy who danced in velvet halls. He wore silk gloves and whispered prayers before stained glass windows. He dreamt of chivalry, of music, of love. They called him golden, strong of arm, sharp of mind, chosen by heaven. But power does not stay golden. And crowns are heavier than they seem. Henry Tudor, once the hope of a nation, became a man dragged into darkness by his own desires. He rewrote the soul of England. Shattered 1,000 years of faith, built cathedrals from the bones of the fallen, all to birth a son, all to defy the silence of God. But in the end he found no peace, not in power, not in flesh, not in death. He ruled for nearly 4 decades, a king worshipped, feared, obeyed, yet he died gasping, alone, drowning in blood and rot, in a room no one dared enter. And even now, his name echoes through time not as a savior, but as a warning. Because power, left unchecked, always consumes itself. His children would inherit his chaos. A boy too frail to stand. A daughter who burned heretics in the streets. Another who ruled like ice wrapped in lace. And all of them, haunted by his shadow. The lion. The tyrant. The broken king who made England bleed. So if you ever walk the halls of Hampton Court, listen. You might hear the click of a cane. The slow drag of a swollen leg across the floor. A whisper full of regret. Or maybe, just maybe, the sound of a throne cracking beneath its crown. If this story gripped you, if it stayed with you in the quiet hours, subscribe. There are more shadows to explore, more kings to bury, and more truths that history tried to forget.